I imagine, like most of you, my reading journey started in elementary school. I read books like The Indian in the Cupboard, The Borrowers, The Boxcar Children, Hardy Boys, and Castle in the Attic. These were a great foundation, but by the time I entered the 6th grade, I was ready for the next step in my literary journey. So at the start of middle school, I turned to books like The Never-Ending Story, Where the Red Fern Grows, Heidi, Hatchet, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and 7 other books that I'm going to talk about in this video. Sometime this last spring I wondered, if I reread these books now, 30 years after graduating middle school, how would I feel about my favorite, most well-remembered books from that time? Would I still like them? Would I find them more or less meaningful? Would I regret returning to them at all? So I picked the 7 books that stood out to me the most from middle school, and I reread them this year. And I thought, for a reading project of this magnitude, it would be only fitting to wrap it all up for a road trip back to my hometown.
Join our hands together and we'll sink in quicksand. Run it out together till we misunderstand. Adopt a life of silence on a trim scrap of land, or reconsider living on the other hand.
Okay, so I am here in my hometown of Osage, Iowa. Behind me is my middle school, home of the Green Devils. Earlier this summer, I reread 7 books from middle school, so I wanted to come back to my hometown, kind of bring you on a tour of my old stomping grounds, and talk about some books. I would love to show you the house that I grew up in as a kid, but another family lives in that house now, and I'm not going to be that creep who knocks on their door and asks them to put their house on YouTube. So instead, here is a shot of me driving down the street that I grew up on, and one of these houses is the house that I grew up in, and you can just imagine, you can just pick one. Pick one of these houses is it. So just pick one for yourself and just use your imagination, okay? All right, so the first book that I want to talk about on my list of rereads from middle school is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. The first time I ever read The Hobbit, it was actually read to me. Now, this was the last book that my father ever read to me as a kid, and I was in the 6th grade. My father read it to me and to all of my siblings. I have 3 younger siblings. I remember the 4 of us kids crowding around my dad, sitting up there on the 2nd floor landing where all of our bedrooms were, gathered around the furnace vent where it was the warmest, and my dad would read the book aloud, 1 chapter a night. My baby sister often fell asleep during these readings, but the rest of us were captivated by the tale of Bilbo Baggins, the 13 Dwarves, and the Wizard Gandalf. Every chapter was a new adventure full of fantastical creatures, and my father was sure to do all the voices. As an adult, I've read The Hobbit at least 4, maybe 5 or 6 times even. I've kind of lost count. But every time I'm teleported back to my youth, exploring Middle-earth with my siblings. My favorite scene from The Hobbit is now and has always been in Chapter 6, where Bilbo and party are pursued by the howling wargs into the night and chased up trees. They're cornered and surrounded by these wild wolves until Gandalf sets them on fire by hurling burning pine cones at them, chasing them away. This buys them enough time for the Lord of the Eagles and some of the other eagles to come down and rescue them and carry them off to their eyrie where they spend the night. I mean, come on, that is just some high fantasy fun right there. As a reread, The Hobbit only gets better every time, and I plan on reading The Hobbit again and again and again, as I will The Lord of the Rings. I don't really talk about Tolkien much on this channel because Tolkien gets talked about ad nauseum on YouTube. But as far as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings go, you can't ask for much more of a foundational literary base. And I found that when I was in middle school, at least with The Hobbit. This is the First Baptist Church of Osage, Iowa, situated on 7th Street, the highway, 218, running north-south through town. It's a prominent landmark in Osage, but it's one of the smallest churches of the town. I grew up here. My father was a deacon, my mom was a Sunday school teacher. I have a lot of memories tied up in this place. But I'm not talking about church today, I'm talking about Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. My memory of Jurassic Park was pretty hazy before I went into it. I had reread Sphere and Airframe in the years since high school, and those books really held up. So I had really high hopes for Jurassic Park, and I was not disappointed. And I apologize for the traffic. Like I said, we are right on the highway, and I'm not going to wait for every car to go by. Now, Jurassic Park could have easily have been called Hubris Park, especially the chapters including John Hammond, the billionaire financier and mastermind behind Jurassic Park, the dinosaur theme park. Right up until the very end, John Hammond insisted that Jurassic Park was a simple idea. And it should have worked too, even after all the systematic failures and dinosaurs killed off half the cast. Hammond insisted that it would have worked if it hadn't been for all of his staff failing him. Regis was incompetent. Arnold and Wu lacked vision. Malcolm was too cynical. Gennaro was small-minded and weak, and Nedry was greedy. If it wasn't for them, the park would have worked just fine. Now, Ian Malcolm, the theoretical mathematician, was by far my favorite character in this book, even though he did little but lecture people on the nature of nature. But without his lectures on chaos theory, this book would have been kind of little but a thoughtful thriller, an imaginative thriller. But the inclusion of Malcolm and the terrific weaving of fractal chaos into the plot, the systematic failures of all the security systems of the park, elevated Jurassic Park to a cautionary tale about how the pursuit of scientific advancement simply for the sake of scientific advancement isn't always a good thing. As a reread, Jurassic Park definitely holds up, and it's my favorite Michael Crichton book. That or Sphere. I can't decide. Jurassic Park or Sphere. And according to my copy, Jurassic Park is soon to be made into a feature film. I can't wait for that to come out. There's a scene in this book where a velociraptor is blown up by a rocket launcher. I can't wait to see that on the silver screen. So this is the city park of Osage. This is the one part of the town that has seen the most changes. None of the stuff that I'm showing you was here when I was growing up. There was a playground, but it didn't look like this. It was all a lot of trees, and there were a few benches to have picnics, but it was just trees and grass, and nothing else was here. There's no spray ground, there was nothing. It was just a lot of grass and open expanse, and they've really built this up. It's actually quite nice. It's a nice park. It's a nice place to come for a walk, but it's not real big, but it's a nice spot. But this is definitely the part of the town that's changed the most. All right, the number 3 book on my list of rereads for middle school is Gulliver's Travels. I remembered liking Gulliver's Travels when I was in middle school, but I did remember thinking that it was kind of long and boring at times. Now, the copy that I read this summer was about 320 pages long or so, but it's fairly small print, and it's sort of difficult prose, especially for maybe a 12-year-old. So maybe at the time it was one of the more challenging, longer books I'd ever gone through. But what I really remembered about it was that it was about tiny people and giants and talking horses and floating islands, and that it was a kind of boys' adventure book that sometimes got sort of boring. Anyway, that's how I remembered it. But reading it again now as an adult opened my eyes to all the political and social satire present in the book. I don't even think I knew what satire was when I was 12 years old. The first book that I was aware of its satire that I ever read, I think, was probably Catch-22, but I didn't read that until I was in high school. And I'm actually going to talk about that in my next video, books that I reread in high school, so stick around for that video. So what does Jonathan Swift satirize in Gulliver's Travels? Well, at first he starts off sort of satirizing the travel writing genre, but he swiftly switches his focus to broader topics, more serious topics like colonialism and war and the law and the treatment of the working class and other social hierarchies and a lot of other things in Western society of the 18th century. And now, while Captain Gulliver pretends at good English patriotism, he interacts with all of the ruling classes of these far-flung lands that he falls into. And through the juxtaposition of his own countrymen, he kind of learns the reality of things. And he realizes slowly and surely that his own English countrymen are a bunch of lethargic and selfish sort of layabouts. Gluttonous too. And there's a good deal of scatological humor in this book, and I can't help but think that that is a reflection of what he really thinks about his English countrymen. Now, it's all well and good that I actually forgot this book in the car, because I had marked a whole bunch of passages that I'd wanted to read aloud to you, but I have 7 books to get through in this video, and I'm not going to get through them if I'm reading quotes out of all of them. But what I recommend is that you read this book for yourself, and you read it slowly, you read it carefully. This is one of those books that's kind of worth making a study out of, and just really enjoy it. You know, I didn't know what Swiftian wit meant, even though I'd read Jonathan Swift, because a lot of it went right over my head when I was a kid. But now as an adult, I get it. I get what that means. I get his wit. I get his humor. It's very clever. And to this day, 300 years later, it's cutting edge humor. So as a reread, Gulliver's Travels was a huge success. 10 out of 10 recommend, poop jokes and all. This is the Borgian log house built in Iowa about 15 years before Tom Sawyer was published. It has absolutely nothing to do with Tom Sawyer, but it's the most historically relevant thing that I can think of in this town. So here it is. Maybe I should get my sunglasses for this. So like a lot of other books read from this time, I didn't really remember a lot from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The one scene that stuck out in my memory is the one scene that most people remember. It's the scene where Tom dupes his friends into whitewashing the fence for him when he doesn't want to do his own chores. Like, that's kind of one of the most famous scenes in American literature, right? That scene comes fairly early on in the novel, and that level of tomfoolery is pretty indicative of the level of shenanigans that Tom gets up to in most of the book. And the reason I didn't really remember a lot of this book, I realized, is that most of the book is a lot of these kinds of stories, really unrelated sort of adventures, if you want to call them that, but they're just sort of anecdotes. They're pranks, or they're just funny stories from Sunday school or whatever. So there's not much in the way of a plot in this book. This isn't the well-established character arc and carefully considered plot of Tom Sawyer. This is the adventures of Tom Sawyer. That is until later on in the book when Huckleberry Finn has entered the narrative and Tom and Huck witness a murder. And from then on, all of the scenes, although still sort of loosely tied together, do sort of share a heightened anxiety. And this kind of heightened anxiety sort of raises the stakes of the book until the final resolution. There was a lot to enjoy about Tom Sawyer, but there's also a lot to kind of forget about Tom Sawyer too. I'm glad I reread it. I don't know that I'm going to be super eager to go back to it again anytime soon. But one thing that it did for me was that it really got me excited to return to Huckleberry Finn. And I did that. As soon as I finished reading Tom Sawyer, I went to read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And I have a lot more to say about Huck Finn than I do about Tom Sawyer. It is a different kind of book entirely. And I have another video on my channel coming up talking exclusively about Huckleberry Finn. It's a long video. But as for Tom Sawyer, I will say that it was a zippy read. It was fun to read. It reminded me a lot of my own boyhood adventures, but it's probably going to be another 30 years before I read it again. So Osage is the county seat of Mitchell County, and so we hosted the county fair every year, and the fairgrounds was a pretty popular place about once a year. Otherwise, it's dead, and there's nothing here. But they don't close it off, and you can just kind of walk around and hang out, do whatever you want, I guess. The FAA comes here and they have shows and everything. So I thought I'd come here and wander around. So in addition to like the demolition derby, they also do like rodeos out here. So I thought this would be a good place to talk about the Western that I read. And that book is Rifled Gold by W.C. Tuttle. Rifled Gold is a Western mystery first published in 1934 by W.C. Tuttle. Now, W.C. Tuttle published 56 novels between 1920 and 1969. 20 of them were Hash Knife Hartley novels. And Hash Knife Hartley is the range detective who is featured in Rifled Gold. And Rifled Gold is actually the 7th Hash Knife Hartley novel. Now, when I was 12 years old and I went to the public library and picked Rifled Gold off the shelf, I didn't realize I was picking up a book that was 7th in a series. At any rate, the reason I picked it off the shelf was because it was a 57-year-old book and it was dusty and it didn't look like anybody had picked it off the shelf in its entire lifetime. And in my 12-year-old brain, I thought it would be funny if I was the one who picked it off the shelf after 57 years and I read it. Now, nobody else was in on this joke. It was just me. Just me. I guess that's what passed as a joke for me when I was 12. But anyway, I took it home and I read the book and I ended up really enjoying it. I didn't remember, before I just now reread it, I didn't remember hardly anything about it. I remember that there was a sack of cash and that they rode horses. That was all I remembered. And so as a Western, it didn't really distinguish itself in my memory very well. But I did remember really enjoying it and being, like, I remember the feeling that I had when I read it. And so when I reread that, I was hoping I was going to be able to recapture that feeling. And boy, did I. It was a lot funnier than I remembered. And the mystery, which I didn't remember it being a mystery, the mystery captivated me all the way through to the end. It was a good yarn. What I hadn't realized was that this is really true American pulp fiction. The dialogue is cheesy, idyllic, and heroic. The heroes promptly overcome peril, and the villains always get what they deserve. The women's are all strong and beautiful, and the fools will make you laugh to beat the band. But the prose and the storytelling just really aren't all that great. There's a lot of scenes that seem to start at inappropriate times, like maybe we're missing some context, and there's also some scenes where characters just pop up out of the blue. You didn't even realize they were in the room. You thought they were somewhere else. So it's a little disorienting in that way. But that's one thing that I'll say for the mystery genre. I think that's really evolved over the years, that we've come to expect a lot more from our mystery novels over the last 100 years. So anyway, as a reread, Rifled Gold was a fun book, and it's kind of inspired me to track down some other Hash Knife Hartley novels. They're hard to find. I'm not finding them in any other bookstores, and my library only has 2 of the 20, and they're the large print editions. So I'm thinking that it might be kind of a fun quest, if you will, to try to track down some of these rare books and to start a Hash Knife Hartley bookshelf at home. That would be kind of fun. So anyway, moving on. This building, now Osage's City Hall, was the library when I was in middle school and had been the library since 1905. This is now the public library in Osage and has been since 1995. I had wanted to do my next little quick book talk in front of one of these 2 buildings, but the traffic on Main Street here is starting to pick up, and I don't want to stand on Main Street with my camera in front of all these people, so I am going to abort that plan. And so now I am standing in front of the grain elevator on the edge of town. So I am fast running out of landmarks to show you. I didn't exactly think this plan through very well, I guess. Osage is not a very big town. It doesn't have a lot to look at. So walk down memory lane is a very short walk. All right, so anyway, I want to talk to you now about Anthem by Ayn Rand. I remembered exactly 2 things about Anthem before I started rereading it. One, that this futuristic society had abolished the personal pronoun of I in favor of we. and 2, that at some point in the book, there's some people walking along a hill. That's all I remembered. The important thing that I took away from this book was the concept of the individual was nigh on impossible for a character to articulate. There's a lot of flies out here, and it smells terrible. Now, Anthem was written in 1937 as a precursor to The Fountainhead. It's really a novella about the ideas of rational thought. The narrator of this story is Equality 72521. He lives in a collectivist society where it is a sin to think for yourself, and it is really a sin to think of yourself. It is also a sin to work outside of your prescribed profession, and for Equality 72521, his profession is a street sweeper. And so when he pursues a line of scientific inquiry and rediscovers electricity, he brings his discovery to the World Council, and he is immediately shunned and sentenced to death. His crime is selfish scientific advancement. When I was a middle schooler, I was blown away by the power of how language can be used to subjugate people. Just the denial of the personal pronoun I was enough to transform the minds of all society into a kind of groupthink. And for 12-year-old Eric, the concept that words could be used to make me think about myself in a different way was transformative to me. Reading Anthem was my very first exposure to this very real concept. As a reread, however, I had a much stronger, deeper, much more negative reaction to Anthem as an adult than I did as a kid. And that's because as an adult, I'm more equipped to absorb Rand's philosophy encoded into her allegorical tales. I still appreciate it for the eye-opener that it was for me at the time. It was, like I said, transformative for me at a certain age. A few weeks ago, I did another video on this channel about Ayn Rand and her philosophy, so if you want to check that out, please feel free. But as for right now, there's a lot of flies buzzing around my legs and they're tickling my shins, and it really kind of smells like shit around here, so I'm gonna get out of here. All right, so we come to it, the last book on this list. The Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Weiss. And I'm just gonna say it up front, this was the worst book out of all the rereads that I've read. So you've got this family, the Robinsons, and you've got Mr. Robinson, who is the lone voice of this novel. He is the only perspective we get. He is the narrator. It is his journal that we're reading, right? And so you've got his wife, Mrs. Robinson. But she doesn't have a name in this book. She's only ever referred to as my wife or the boy's mother. But then you've got the 4 boys. They do have names, but they're all basically interchangeable. I never get a sense for who any of these boys are. Anyway, the family survives very easily, I should say, on all the local flora and fauna. They eat a lot of lobster dinners. They eat better than I do a lot of the time. But they hunt bison, and they're worried about conserving gunpowder, but they never run out in 10 years. They've got a 10-year supply of gunpowder. Like, I don't know who shipwrecks with that much gunpowder. And nobody freaks out at any point in the novel. There's no conflict between any of the characters. They all act like they're on a well-provisioned camping trip in a state park. And they spend a lot of time praising God for looking after them, and they turn to God for prayer for everything. But never once do they ever curse God for their plight. You know, like it would be realistic at some point for a believer to lose faith after being stranded on an island for 10 years without rescue, to lose faith at least once. I mean, come on. That'd be realistic, but they never do. These characters read like inanimate objects. And where in the hell in the world are they anyway? What island at the same time has bananas and bison and lobsters and penguins all within walking distance? You know what I would love? Since the Swiss Family Robinson is in the public domain, I would love for somebody out there to write kind of a companion novel to this, where Mrs. Robinson has kept a journal of her own, but a more realistic journal where they don't have infinite gunpowder, and they haven't kept the faith the whole time, and their deeds aren't super heroic, and there is conflict between the family members, and maybe not everybody survived or whatever, right? Like, and maybe they didn't have all these animals and everything wasn't provided in abundance, and maybe it wasn't their faith that got them through, right? Maybe they struggled like hell. Maybe it was their own hard wits that finally got them through. Maybe they had to make some terrible sacrifices. Maybe they had to make some terrible decisions. But Mr. Robinson was bound and determined to write his own narrative should they ever be rescued, so that he maintained his reputation as a good and godly man. So he kept his journal in such a way that would be the official record, right? So in that way, he's the unreliable narrator, but we only come to that realization in retrospect through reading this companion novel. That would be a good book, and that would make the Swiss Family Robinson actually worth reading then. So if anybody out there wants to steal that idea, please do. Just send me a copy of it when you're done. I would absolutely love to read it. And Mrs. Robinson could actually tell us what her name is. Imagine that. So anyway, as a reread, The Swiss Family Robinson was a complete waste of time, and I get spun up every time I think about how terrible this book was. But thankfully, I am about to head down this trail. This is the Harry Cook Nature Trail, as you can see here. This trail leads to Spring Park. In my next video, I'm going to talk about 10 books that I reread from high school. And I've already used up all of the sites in Osage. So I came back to my hometown to kind of give you a tour of town, and I've done that. You've seen everything there is to see, except for Spring Park. And Spring Park is the coolest part of town. And so I'm going to head down this trail, and I'm going to talk to you about the 10 books that I reread from high school now. So stick around for when that video comes out, and I will see you in the next one.